very warm and convivial welcome to everybody who has tuned in for tonight's talk. Tonight's talk is the first talk in a series of talks that Reclaim the Enlightenment and Transnatera are offering to mark the occasion of North being 100 years old, or partition being 100 years old, or whatever perspective you have on that event. Tonight's talk is from John Gray, who, in case, in the unlikely event that you don't know who John Gray is, he's usually described as the Chief Librarian of the Linnenhall Library in Belfast, the former Chief Librarian of the Linnenhall Library in Belfast. He's a much published author and a deep thinker and an activist across many different issues in the north of Ireland. John's talk is called Northern Ireland, a Carnival of Reaction, or a cause for celebration. So he is expecting to speak for about 50 minutes tonight. After John has stopped talking, he wants to welcome comments and questions from, from us. The way to get a question through to John is to type it into the chat box, which I hope you can find on your Zoom screen there. So without further ado, please, I'd like to hand you over to John. Thank you. Thank you. John Gray.
Welcome, everybody. Many of you will recognize the phrase, the Carnival of Reaction, which I use in the title of this talk. It was coined by James Connolly, speaking on the steps of the Central Library in Belfast in 1914 and addressing the threat of partition. Connolly, the revolutionary socialist though he was, had engaged in social democratic politics, had helped form the Irish Labour Party, which he had hoped could provide an effective working class voice in a new Home Rule parliament. Those hopes were dashed by the threat of partition and the suspension of Home Rule itself on the outbreak of the First World War. Was Connolly being alarmist? The Labour movement and the Catholic community had had a foretaste of what was to come in 1912, when 3,000 workers had been expelled from their workplaces, including 600 rotten prods, or those with known Labour or Liberal sympathies. The other quotation in my title is merely the word celebration, and one coined by Boris Johnston and echoed by our Secretary of State, Brandon Lewis, in announcing plans to mark the centenary of the creation of Northern Ireland. Well, let us scar those formative events and the subsequent trajectory of the state to see if we can detect the slightest cause for celebration. Partition and the creation of Northern Ireland were fruits of the Government of Ireland Act, which became law in December 1920. This was in fact a fantasy act. It provided for the establishment of separate Home Rule parliaments in the north and south, linked by a Council of Ireland, which it was envisaged would oversee some common services and provide for the possibility of future cooperation or even unification. But long before the Act was passed, Sinn Féin had triumphed in the south and established their separatist Parliament of Dáil Éireann in January 1919. On the same day, the first action in what was to be known as the War of Independence took place. For them, a minimalist Home Rule dispensation was a dead letter. From the perspective of the overwhelmingly conservative British government, it hardly mattered that the Government of Ireland Act was from the outset largely a dead letter, or that what was to become Northern Ireland was left as the awkward orphan of the process. They had found a means to provide for their unionist allies in Ulster. It was not that unionists sought their own home rule. They actually opposed the early stages of the legislation at Westminster. They would have preferred Britain to pursue the war against Republicans in the South to a successful conclusion, and for a united Ireland to remain within the United Kingdom. James Craig, our future Prime Minister, however, saw the possibilities in the new dispensation. He was, after all, a member of the British cabinet and had been on the inside track as the Government of Ireland Act was drawn up, a process from which nationalists were wholly excluded. The delineation of the new Northern Ireland was determined on an entirely sectarian basis. Unionists had originally aspired to control the 9 counties of the historic province of Ulster. That would have created an entity in which Unionists and Nationalists would have been relatively evenly balanced. But that was not safe enough for the Unionist leadership. They abandoned Cavan, Donegal, and Monaghan and the 70,000 Protestants in those counties in order to guarantee themselves an overwhelming 2/3 Protestant majority in a 6-county jurisdiction. There could be no easy birth for such a state, as at the very outset, it had defined itself by its Protestantism. It was inevitable that Catholics and nationalists would bitterly resist its creation, while substantial elements of wider civic society looked askance at what was being done, or did not believe that a northern state could emerge as a viable entity. Even within the 6 counties, Unionists faced unreconciled nationalist majorities in Fermanagh, Tyrone, and our second city of Derry, and substantial minorities elsewhere. There were others beyond the sphere of either unionism or nationalism. On May Day 1919, 100,000 Labour supporters turned out in Omer Park in Belfast. In January 1920, 12 Labour councillors were elected to the City Council. As the War of Independence gathered pace, Labour as well as Sinn Féin had to be targeted in unionist rhetoric. It was against this background that Carson spoke on the 12th of July 1920, implicating Labour in an overarching conspiracy. The most insidious method is tacking on the Sinn Féin question and the Irish Republican question to the Labour question. What I say is this: these men who come forward posing as the friends of Labour care no more about Labour than does the man in the moon. Beware of these insidious methods. A massive wave of workplace expulsions immediately followed. This time, no less than 10,000 men and 1,000 women in the linen mills, suffered, of whom 1/4 were rotten prods. Amongst those expelled was James Baird, one of the leaders of the 1919 engineering strike. As he said, every man who was prominently known in the Labour movement was expelled from his work. The men who carried out the expulsions described themselves as industrial black and tans. Nor was there any return for those evicted. Carson praised his friends, the shipyard men. The expellees turned in desperation to Dáil Éireann, which authorized the Belfast boycott. In the meantime, unionists were arming to defend their position. From the beginning of the year, in various areas, the UVF reappeared. with arms dug up from here and there, which dated from before the First World War. In September, the British government agreed to formalize this mobilization as a special constabulary, and soon enough provided them with 36,000 rifles. Facts were being created on the ground before the passage of the Government of Ireland Act. Eventually, almost 1 in 5 Protestant males in Northern Ireland were armed. King George came to Belfast to open the new Northern Ireland Parliament in June 1921. His speech was a model of conciliation. He hoped that this historic gathering may be the prelude of the day in which the Irish people, north or south, under one parliament or two, as those parliaments may decide, shall work together in common love for Ireland. On the eve of truce negotiations with Sinn Féin, it seemed to leave the possibility of Irish unity open. Far from it. In fact, as Winston Churchill, chair of the Cabinet Committee on Irish Affairs, put it, from that moment, the position of Ulster became unassailable. The new Northern administration had to be established from scratch. As the very able civil servant Ernest Clark described it, he had to set about creating 7 government departments, armed only with a table, a chair, and an Act of Parliament. This was in contrast to the Free State, where the new government, when it was established, simply inherited the former British structures. As the jest has it, all they did was paint the letterboxes green. The very success of the Southern Republicans compounded Northern difficulties, because when the treaty negotiations began, steps by Westminster to formalize Northern structures were largely frozen. Even the treaty signed in December 1921, one made between the British and the Irish alone, introduced a further element of doubt in the agreement to set up a boundary commission, which nationalists hoped would reallocate significant areas in the 6 counties to the southern state. Meanwhile, unionist difficulty with its nationalist minority became manifest when control of local government was handed over to the Northern government in December 1921. After the 1920 local elections, 25 local authorities had remained in nationalist hands. Now, most refused to recognize the new state. The unionist government promptly imposed commissioners to run them. Meanwhile, teachers in maintained schools also refused to recognize the new state and relied on Dáil Éireann to pay their salaries. Throughout this period, violence continued. The IRA remained very active, but the Northern Ireland state now had 50,000 men in arms. It was an unequal struggle, and the Catholic community continued to suffer disproportionately, whether through lethal reprisals or burning out. I don't want to avoid the issue that there were retaliatory killings that Protestants suffered too, but the overwhelming burden fell on the Catholic community. It was against this background that Craig and Michael Collins, the new Irish leader, held talks in January and March 1922 to try to secure an accommodation. In a sense, it involved Collins recognizing the existence of the Northern state and Craig acknowledging Collins's position as the leader of the Southern state. From Craig's point of view, he hoped to secure an end to the IRA campaign and to the Belfast boycott. Collins hoped to get expelled workers back to work, to secure additional protections for the Catholic community generally, and to secure the release of prisoners. Although the agreements they reached were greeted as an outbreak of peace, they almost immediately broke down. Neither party delivered, or perhaps they could not deliver, on the assurances they had given. Almost simultaneously, the new Northern Ireland Parliament rushed through the draconian Special Powers Act, which allowed for detention without trial, flogging, the death sentence for arms and explosives offences, and other utterly unrestricted restrictions on civil liberties. As the IRA sought to maintain its campaign, they were outlawed in May, and the first 200 were interned, then a number which soon rose to 500. Amongst the internees were a considerable number of leaders of constitutional nationalism. It was a general beheading of the leadership of the political Catholic community. The outbreak of the Irish Civil War in June 1922, followed by the death of Collins in August 1922, greatly strengthened the unionist position. Notably, the remaining IRA threat soon evaporated. By the end of the year, the unionist government had secured peace on its own terms. There is an easy narrative in suggesting that the unionist government was uniquely brutal in its response to the security challenges that it faced. In fact, it largely replicated the measures which the British government had employed in the South and in other colonial situations. The notorious Special Powers Act was the offspring of the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act. Curfews were freely employed. The B specials bore close similarity to the Black and Tans, though locally recruited and mainly from the UVF, and thus on a sectarian basis. The Black and Tans had been at the forefront of indiscriminate reprisals tacitly sanctioned by the British government, and the B specials often played the same role in the new Northern Ireland state. There just remained a threat to the unionist position of the Boundary Commission. They refused to nominate a member of the commission, but the British government obliged by appointing a unionist to represent them. In 1925, the likely findings of the commission were leaked, and to the horror of nationalists, revealed that no significant transfer of territory was envisaged. The Free State prevented publication of the commission's report, but de facto accepted the border established in 1921 and did so in return for the writing off of the Irish state's share of the United Kingdom debt, and this rather than seeking guarantees for the protection of Northern nationalists. It was a final betrayal. That should have provided a stable basis for the new Northern Ireland polity to develop and to seek to reach an accommodation with its minority. It had already, however, taken fatal steps to ensure enduring bitterness and discrimination. In 1923, the government abolished PR in local elections, and in 1924, set up a commission to review electoral boundaries. This introduced what became known as the technique of gerrymandering, whereby unionists won a majority of wards in nationalist areas with slim majorities, while the large majorities won by nationalists in the remaining wards were useless. The best known example was in Derry, where as late as 1966, the Catholic population outnumbered Protestants 2-1, but the corporation comprised 12 unionists and only 8 nationalists. Other disabilities followed. Discrimination in employment and the allocation of housing was endemic. Stability of a sort certainly became the order of the day, though perhaps it is better described as stasis. This was certainly true of the government's endless paranoia with regard to security. The Special Powers Act, originally envisaged as a temporary measure, became permanent. The B specials recruited in an emergency could not be disbanded. New acts to keep the nationalist minority suitably corralled followed. How serious was the nationalist or Republican threat? Constitutional nationalism had been rendered impotent, as it oscillated between attendance at Stormont or abstention. The Unionist government reached a reasonable accommodation with Cosgrave's Free State government. Certainly the election of De Valera and Fianna Fáil in 1932 caused alarm, but his bark proved worse than his bite, and he helped jail and execute Republicans when the IRA embarked on a futile military campaign in 1938. The Southern-backed anti-partition League campaign of 1948 to 1949 and the declaration of a republic by the Southern state in December 1948 merely solidified the Unionist vote in the 1949 election, while the British Labour government guaranteed the North's continued constitutional position. The IRA campaign from 1956 to 1962 was simply ineffective. Yes, one has to agree there were periodic crises, but unionism depended on a perpetual siege mentality. Certainly the new state had secured the trappings of democracy, enshrined in the enormous pretensions of its gigantic palace that stormed, more befitting an empire than a small state. Yet it did not function as a live democracy. As unionists planned at the outset, they had a perpetual and massive majority in their parliament. When in the 1920s there were signs that Labour and independents were making advances, Craig abolished PR for the Stormont elections. As he put it, what I want are men who are for the union on the one hand, or who are against it on the other. It was a simple recipe for dominance. In Stormont elections and at local government level, many seats remained uncontested. The only act ever successfully introduced by the opposition related not to the protection of people, but the protection of wildlife. Stasis was true of the leadership of unionism. The young Turks of the pre-First World War resistance to Home Rule simply aged in office. In 1938, Sir Wilfrid Spender, permanent secretary of the Ministry of Finance, was in a state of despair at the lack of prudence and forethought that was the hallmark of the government, compounded by a disregarding of their responsibilities and their mistakes. Craig, now Lord Craigavon, was ill and incapable of doing more than 1 hour's constructive work per day. By 1940, in the face of a mounting wartime crisis, there was an unusual rebellion in the ranks. In resigning from the cabinet, Edmund Warnock described how when a person became a member of the government, he became a tenant for life. Nothing but death, illness, or promotion removes anybody. Lord Craigavon was removed by death in November 1940. He was replaced by John Andrews at 69, another aged veteran. And by 1943, in the disastrous aftermath of the Blitz, even his backbenchers had to conclude he was not up to the job. Certainly then, a younger man, Basil Brooke, later Lord Brookborough, was chosen perhaps as much because of his impeccably militant history in defense of the Orange State as because of any other obvious aptitude. But he too was to endure, surviving as Prime Minister for 20 years until 1963, when he was aged 74. Thus, whatever about the wider state of democracy, there was precious little sign of democratic refreshment within the Unionist Party itself. It was always a decidedly part-time government, but insofar as it had a philosophy, it was a deeply conservative one, with a cabinet dominated by landowners and businessmen. They saw a limited role for government, and especially in terms of social intervention. They failed to deal with the social crisis of the Great Depression, with a growing housing crisis, or with the challenge of the Second World War. One controlled the columns of Hansard without finding any significant social reform initiative led by the Unionist government. And if there was a vacuum in the field of social development, what was left? Celebration of the Union, of empire, and of the Protestant identity of the state. The guardians of this emphasis were well embedded in government. In the entire period up to 1969, all but 3 cabinet members were also members of the Orange Order. That was one powerful influence that acted as a brake on any progressive departure. Together with the Protestant churches, they succeeded in destroying Lord Londonderry's 1923 Education Act, which could have removed clerical control from the state education sector. Though it has to be said that the refusal of the Catholic Church to engage at all in the process helped open the door to the Protestant counteroffensive. At times when the government was under pressure, because of its failure to deal with social crises, it played the Protestant card. This was notably the case in the 1930s, the time of the unemployment riots, when the unemployment catastrophe was affecting its own Protestant working class supporters. In 1933, Sir Joseph Davison, Grand Master of the Orange Order, asked, "When will the Protestant employers of Northern Ireland recognize their duty to their Protestant brothers and sisters and employ them to the exclusion of Roman Catholics?" There was a ready response from Sir Basil Brooke, as I've already noted, our future Prime Minister, who declared, "I have not a Roman Catholic about my place." A year later, Craig declared, "We are a Protestant Parliament and a Protestant state." Even when communal tensions were at a critical level, the Orange Order could always march. In 1935, the government at first banned the Belfast 12, but then withdrew the ban. Serious riots followed. Throughout the history of the state, marches were forced through nationalist territory. As late as August 1969, the agreement to permit the apprentice boys to march in Derry led to riots which marked the real commencement of our troubles. But whether unionists liked it or not, reform was coming. Courtesy of the union, courtesy of the reforming post-war Labour government. To this, we owe the arrival of the welfare state and free and universal education. Indeed, these were notable benefits of the union, if not the gift of the unionist state. In fact, unionist MPs at Westminster had opposed the Labour programme, and their government in Northern Ireland sought to dilute the impact of the British reforms in crucial ways. It was not going to be step by step in vital areas. Crucially, they did not follow the Labour government's introduction of a universal franchise in local elections, and in 1946 introduced their own representation, or perhaps might have been better described as a lack of representation of the people bill. They retained the provisions by which only householders and ratepayers had the vote, while business owners had additional votes. And they added an extra exclusion of lodgers. In other less controversial ways, they were simply behind the times. There was no equivalent to the British Town and Country Planning Act of 1947. Unionists didn't believe in planning. When Lord Brickborough finally retired in 1963 and was replaced by the patrician Terence O'Neill, there were hopes that change was in the air. In the face of the decline of Northern Ireland's traditional industries and rising unemployment, the appearance of modernisation and a more interventionist role for government were a necessity. O'Neill visited Catholic schools, met with nuns, and even with a teacher, Jack Lynch, despite Paisley's objections. Yet key decisions played to the Protestant heartlands. Our first motorway, the M1, went to Dungannon instead, or nearly to Dungannon, instead of Newry, and on the road to Dublin, the busiest route in Ireland. Our new city was named Craigavon. The new university was awarded to Coleraine, not Derry. Was there any leaven in this dismal history? What about arts and culture in Northern Ireland? We were this distinctive place. Surely there was something to play with there. Well, playing was often abolished or forbidden or undermined. As one commentator succinctly put it, the unionist attitude to the arts was marked by the 5 Ps: paranoia, parochialism, parsimony, prejudice, and puritanism. The poet John Hewitt, writing in 1945, described the situation of authors as one of supping at the bitter gourd. It was not that there was or use of a formal system of censorship for writers. There was no need for one, because Northern Ireland had no serious publisher until the emergence of Black Star Press in 1971. In any case, informal pressures were just as effective. The shipyard poet and playwright and independent Orangeman, Thomas Conduff, writing in 1952, spoke of how intimidation of the mind enters every sphere of cultural life. And in particular, writers who make their living in state or municipal employment have to be ever on guard over what they write. John Hewitt's mistake was that he was unguarded, and hence in 1957 was denied the position of director of the Ulster Museum and was literally sent to Coventry. Meanwhile, the late Ian Hill has pointed to the colonial provincialism which starved many Ulster institutions of the era with imported and often unsuitable English adventurers preferred over their more capable Ulster compatriots. Most infamously, our foremost and semi-professional theatre company, the Group Theatre, was torn apart in 1958 in the controversy over Sam Thompson's play Over the Bridge, which graphically portrayed sectarianism in the shipyard. Over the Bridge had actually been accepted and announced by the theatre when the board stopped it. Thompson refused to make cuts that would have emasculated the play. The man in pole position was John Ritchie McKee, and he indeed was a pole position man. He was brother of the Unionist Lord Mayor of Belfast. He was chairman of the group board. He was chairman of the Standing Committee for the Encouragement of Music and the Arts, the predecessor of the Arts Council. And if that wasn't enough, he was also the national governor of the BBC for Northern Ireland. He explained, this play is full of grossly vicious phrases and situations which would undoubtedly offend and affront every section of the public. Eventually, Jimmy Ellis and many of the actors rebelled and managed to stage the play at the Empire in January 1960 with enormous success. A decade later, and in 1968, the inspirational lyric theatre, with its national outlook, inspired by Yeats, moved from the drawing room of the O'Malleys. It was initially a purely private enterprise, to a new purpose-built theatre, but now needed private sponsorship and public funding. Frank Benner, a businessman, lyric trustee, and member of the Arts Council, had enlisted a shadowy group of businessmen. But for him, the lyric was still politically suspect, and its attitude to the Constitution must be clarified. The problem was that the O'Malleys refused to play the national anthem at the end of performances. It was only with great difficulty that the lyric survived the controversy. I should perhaps say, as a sort of afternote on the cultural front, that in the succeeding 50 years, writers, artists, actors have managed to break through nearly all the barriers and the covert censorship, the overt censorship, the withdrawals of funding when it's something controversial is put on. And our artists and writers, despite the underfunding of the arts, make a signal contribution to a wider and broader and more inclusive Northern Ireland, perhaps despite the circumstances in which they have to work. But let's return to the O'Neill era. The very basis on which Terence O'Neill hoped to persuade Unionist voters to adopt a more tolerant approach to their fellow Catholic citizens displayed extraordinary insensitivity. And remember, this is liberal unionism as per Terence O'Neill. As late as 1969, he argued, if you give Roman Catholics a good job and a good house, they will live like Protestants. They will refuse to have 18 children. Of course, Catholics had fewer prospects of good jobs and good houses if the entire apparatus of discrimination remained in place. O'Neill did nothing to dismantle it. In other ways, nothing had changed. When the RUC Baton marches in Derry in October 1968, they were engaging in standard practice, but this time there was a difference. It was on television. It was seen all around the world. There was another difference. Those marchers were also merely demanding rights that they should have had in a British context. It was against that background that the Civil Rights Campaign rapidly gathered momentum and impact beyond these shores. The difficulty for unionism was that it was torn between a recognition that at least limited reform was needed and the entire history of the state. If indeed its survival had depended on providing a Protestant state for a Protestant people, in which it was a matter of conviction that Catholics were inherently enemies, then any reform was a betrayal. That was the fundamental contradiction that fueled the Paisleyite and Loyalist counter-reaction. In the event, the unionist leadership tried to play it both ways. Under pressure from the British government, they indeed embarked on limited reforms, but they simultaneously reverted to that playbook which had been so successful in the 1920s. Use of the Special Powers Act, new repressive legislation, calling out of the B specials, and most disastrous of all, the reintroduction of internment. Meanwhile, loyalist foot soldiers were all too willing, and again as in the 1920s, to join in an assault on the Catholic ghettos. The adoption of a war footing by government meant that the civil rights movement and the more political official Republican movement were soon eclipsed by the provisional IRA and the appeal of armed struggle, pure and simple, and for a united Ireland. Who now remembers the provisional's purported years of victory in 1973 and 1974? Ideologically, in that phase, they were a simple throwback to the failed struggles of the 1920s, but they were sustained by the repressive conditions on the ground. And here those other players in the Union, the British government, which for 50 years had ignored conditions in Ulster, were now key participants. They, no less than the unionist leadership, were pulled two ways. Far more than the unionists, they recognized the need for reforms. They also greatly increased government expenditure and, amongst other things, paid for the complete renewal of the working class housing stock within 20 years. That was a positive side of the union. Yet British governments, whether Tory or Labour, first sought to work with the unionist government before the introduction of direct rule, and then always took account of the unionist majority in determining policy. That perspective limited the extent to which they pushed reforms. More balefully, British governments largely bought into the unionist security agenda. They, after all, backed the fatal introduction of internment. British troops had at first been welcomed by beleaguered Catholic communities, but when they became targets for the provisionals, a colonial mentality was soon enough in the ascendance. Tactics including divide and rule and honed in the utterly inappropriate colonial arenas of Malaya, Kenya, and Aden were applied here. If you were a soldier, you could see where your friends were. It was where the Union Jacks flew. We went on to get criminalization of political prisoners, the hunger strikes, the recruitment of a new local militia, the Ulster Defence Regiment, shoot to kill, and collusion. It was the British government and not our local unionists that eventually recognized that this was a war that could not be won. As the provisionals had belatedly come to the same conclusion, there was a basis for our peace. How stands Northern Ireland now? Our new power-sharing administration has more often displayed dysfunction than cohesion, even when sitting. Since it was first established in 1999, it has collapsed 5 times and for nearly a third of its life. An enduring feature of conflict in the Assembly is continued unionist difficulty in coming to terms with power sharing. The endless distraction of historic sore points means that there's a chronic failure to resolve other key issues. We now have at least 59 so-called peace walls, stretching for some 21 miles, more than at the time of the Good Friday Agreement. Paramilitary organizations still hold sway in many working class areas. Civil disturbances on a wide scale periodically break out. They're now primarily reflecting loyalist resentment at the changed order of things, and a resentment fueled by the stance of unionist leaders. There were the Drum Creek protests of 1995 to 2000 over Orange marching rights, the disgraceful siege of Holy Cross Primary School in 2001 to 2, the flag protests in 2012 over reduced flag flying, and now riots spawned by the Northern Ireland Protocol and a Republican funeral that breached COVID regulations. Meanwhile, continued militant activity by dissident Republicans, though marginal in overall impact, remains a security concern. The failure of our politics has consequences. Our economy is still a basket case. Since 2000, we've seen the lowest growth in GDP per head and the lowest growth in productivity in the UK. We also have the lowest rate of capital investment. Although the UK subvention of, is it 9 or 10 billion per annum, amounts to approximately 20% of our GDP, average incomes after tax are only approximately 80% of the UK average. We also have a yawning gap between rich and poor. How do we explain this dismal performance? There is a Troubles legacy. Continued political and sectarian conflict and periodic rioting does act as a disincentive to investment. But other failures are involved too. That is most obvious in the field of education. In United Kingdom terms, we had the highest share of early school leavers and the lowest share of those with third-level qualifications. That is a disaster in terms of denied human opportunity, but also means that we have inadequate human capital to achieve sustained development. Why is this? A major cause is the continued use of selection at 11+. That does provide for an elite grammar school education for an overwhelmingly middle-class minority, but consigns the majority to the secondary sector, where many schools serving deprived areas can aptly be described as sink schools, where most pupils leave with minimal qualifications. For once, it's not a sectarian issue. The Catholic middle class are equally determined to preserve privileged education as those in the state sector. What does remain a mystery is why unionist parties, with their large dependence on working class votes, have been so determined to sustain selection. Of course, sectarianism imposes wholly unproductive costs, the duplication of everything. And meanwhile, funding for integrated education, surely the path to the future remains inadequate. Despite all of this, a case could still be made for the union, and this as opposed to our semi-detached entity. We should at least acknowledge the annual 10 billion subvention that ensures that we merely suffer relative poverty. It was the union that brought us the post-war welfare state and a series of reforms during the Troubles. Would our unionists on their own ever have abolished the B specials or gerrymandering in local government? More recently, we have had to rely on Westminster to bring us into the modern world by legislating for same-sex marriage and a woman's right to choose. Yet our own unionists hardly celebrate most of these benefits of union. Understandably, our executive couldn't agree what to do about Northern Ireland's centenary. Enter then, and with staggering insensitivity, the British government. As Boris Johnston put it, it is something obviously to celebrate because I love and believe in the union that makes up the United Kingdom, the most successful political partnership in the world. Not for restless Scots who are on the eve of voting for independence. Not now, apparently, for the 40% of the Welsh who favour independence. Not for the 43% of our population that want a united Ireland. Nor now for loyalist rioters or for unionists who believe that Johnston has betrayed the union with our new Irish Sea border. Then there are those of us who simply believe that the facts of the matter do not merit celebration. Johnston's statement seemed to derogate from then Secretary of State Peter Brooke's famous statement that Britain had no selfish or strategic interest in maintaining the Union. Johnston's selfish strategic interest may simply be to bolster up unwarranted English nationalist confidence, regardless of the damage he does to relationships with the devolved regions. The recent decision to permanently fly the Union Jack from government buildings is part of this impetus. But even Johnston has had to recognise that Northern Ireland is not as British as Finchley, and that his beloved union is far from a seamless one, and hence, much to the disappointment of unionists, the flag-waving edict has not been extended here. On the eve of the centenary, Johnston's hyperbole seems simultaneously ridiculous and divisive. The actual launch of plans for the centenary was marked by a stupendous own goal, with the use of Seamus Heaney's image to symbolise the supposed inclusivity of the endeavour, except that Heaney's family were not consulted about his inclusion. It was a fine case of cultural grave robbery. True, the gravitas is offered with the formation of a centenary forum and the centenary historical advisory panel led by Lord Bute, but historians should always be wary of being co-opted as window dressers for unpalatable government manifestos. You'll be glad to hear that the churches are on board, and indeed that the Catholic hierarchy has been critical of nationalists for standing aloof. The churches are going to hold an ecumenical service, a splendid opportunity for them to atone for the part they played in exacerbating the divisions that led to partition. What then is happening on the ground? If you explore the internet, you will find a Northern Ireland Centennial website where, for some unexplained reason, the mascot is Frederick the Lion. The opening blurb acknowledges that many will have differing views on the formation of Northern Ireland. Indeed so, but apparently we want to mark the occasion in a way that celebrates and commemorates all that is good about our wee country. For some, that will immediately raise the question as to whether in Nolanese we are a country, but not for children who are invited to enter a competition and tell us why I love Northern Ireland. You can purchase a bust of Lord Craigavon, a Northern Ireland centennial bench, and various knickknacks. Though the linked Empire Poppy store, have we still got an empire? Offers a wider range, including special offers on flags and bunting. Then there's the Facebook page where we enlist stock photos of Northern Ireland scenery and celebrate a few sportsmen and inventors in what is an entirely woman-free zone. We do find totemic enterprises for unionists, Linfield, the shipyard, the Ulster Defence Regiment. Surprisingly, Adrian Dunbar pops up here, but he's soon enough spotted. There's a comment. Nothing to like about this fella regards Northern Ireland. He'd get rid of it in a heartbeat. Well, if you're shocked and distressed by that, then you can go off and sign a new Ulster Covenant. All this is the handiwork of the Ancra, I'm not sure I pronounced that right, Psalm Association, which is based in Brownlow House, home of the Royal Black Preceptory. One wonders what the average English person would make of this banal vision of the virtues of the Union. To many, we must seem like those South Sea Islanders who worship the Duke of Edinburgh as a god. I'm left wondering, are these official signs? But they seem to have cornered the market. There is no sign of any more restrained official intervention. Some of us recall the Ulster 71 festival in Botanic Park, held to mark the 50th anniversary of our state. That coincided with the introduction of internment, a plummeting step on the road to a 30-year disaster. Few anticipate any such catastrophe now, though the future of the Northern Ireland state remains uncertain, with 51% of our population believing that we will leave the United Kingdom within 25 years. While nationalists should beware of repeating the simplistic fiasco of the anti-partition league in the 1940s, it does seem that inexorable change in the political and demographic landscape will lead in that direction. Meanwhile, we in Reclaim the Enlightenment are still committed to trying to secure a better and more civilized life for all in Northern Ireland, regardless of the longer term outlook. The best that we can hope is that this centenary will pass with a whimper rather than a bang. Thank you very much.
That was absolutely great, John. Brilliant analysis. Thank you very much. I think we all enjoyed that. I'll hand you over to Francis Kane now when he comes on.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much indeed, John. Really very enjoyable talk. There are a few comments and questions to put to you.
I can see things coming up here.
Yes.
I just ask you to start your video.
Oh, grand. Thanks, Liam. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Frank.
Okay, I'm trying to do that. Just everybody the okay. It's telling me the host has stopped my video. I'm not sure how that's happened. Let me just put the questions to John anyway. There was an interesting point made by Eddie Bowen about the Irish suffragette movement pre-1918. Eddie commented that it's the only truly non-sectarian, non-denominational movement on the island at that time. You know, Eddie wants to ask.
I think that's a fair point.
Indeed.
And interestingly, I mean, it was certainly, if anything, I would have said in the North there were more Protestants involved than Catholics, and they were extremely militant. I mean, after all, they harassed Carson. Well, it was sufficiently militant. They let off bombs and they burnt down the tea house here on Cave Hill, just above me. And you see, I mean, the interesting thing is that the Ulster Unionists, some of them actually favoured women's suffrage, whereas actually the Irish Nationalist Party was resolutely against it. So it was a very mixed picture in terms of who was going to support it politically or not. It's worth commenting that women got the vote in the Republic, soon after the Free State was created. It took till 1928 before women got the vote in Northern Ireland.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's really very interesting perspective on the history. Eddie also asked for your view of whether the traditional two sides are ever likely to come to an accommodation, or indeed whether there is a growing, a bigger third side emerging in Northern Irish society.
Well, I think that so long as you're dealing in sort of absolutist visions of what your culture is, on either side, on the one side that you should worship the monarchy, you should fly flags on every street corner. Perhaps on the other side, you should put the tricolour up at every opportunity and speak nothing but Irish. Sorry, on the Unionist side, speak nothing but Ulster Scots. Other side, nothing but Irish. Although, in fact, the cultural history of both Irish and Ulster Scots historically crosses the community divide. If you go to Donegal, you'll find plenty of Catholics who speak very good Ulster Scots. You also discover that many of those who fought to preserve the Irish language were Ulster Presbyterians.
Mm-hmm.
Our cultural history is so much richer and more complex than absolutists on both sides would make it to be. But so long as we're dealing with absolutists, you will not get an easy accommodation.
Indeed, some of it.
It's clear that a less partisan centre is showing signs of emerging. I mean, this business of people who don't actually define themselves as either British or Irish, but sort of go for that middle ground of Northern Irish. No, so long as going for the middle ground doesn't mean that you have to believe in nothing. That's always slightly my worry about the middle ground. Actually, I don't believe in anything strongly in order to ensure that I never offend anybody. Well, I'm sorry, I'm not that sort of person. But it helps to have a middle ground. I mean, it obviously has helped in a good example is the city council, where unionists, Belfast City Council, where unionists lost their previous absolute control in the late 90s. But the middle ground parties, and perhaps in particular the Alliance Party, but now also People for Profit and the Greens, hold the balance of power and can mediate between the major power blocks on either side. The two major power blocks are obviously the DUP and Sinn Féin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The middle ground can put manners on the extremes. If the extremes want to get anything done, they've got to get the middle ground on board. That's quite a useful political art to learn.
You're here, John. Yes, indeed. And, some of us speak Ulster Scots and Irish,
I knew you were fluent. I knew you were fluent.
And indeed, in this, identitarian, framework that we all live under, it's great just to hear some voices of reason. I'm really sorry to be so insistent. There quite a few people have got questions, so let me now move to John Linus. John was asking.
Hello, John.
Yeah, John was asking about a British commentator, a British MP in the 1950s, criticising the sectarianism in the Northern Irish state at that time. And he was wondering if you knew anything about that, for example, the man's name, or how effective his campaign was at that time. John,
I know,
that,
John.
GB, the involvement of GB in Northern Ireland was quite late to the, to the history. So
I know who John's referring to. I think his name began with, was he Bing? Was that his name? B-Y-N-G. And I think he published a pamphlet, but I'd need to check up. I mean, one of the sad things about this history is that the convention was that Northern Ireland had responsibility for its own affairs, and Westminster governments, including Labour governments, resolutely refused to interfere. You were left with a small minority of MPs, usually on the left wing of the Labour Party, who were willing to raise issues here. The National Council for Civil Liberties on several occasions sent delegations here and issued reports, but they were very much on the margins of political power in Britain. And I mean, if you talk about the benefits of union, well, we certainly in being allowed to fester the way we did for 50 years by the Westminster government, you could hardly describe that as a benefit of union.
Okay. Great. Thanks a lot for that. And yes, we just heard there from Peter Collins. Thank you, Peter, that it was indeed a man called Geoffrey Bing.
I was right.
Yeah. So moving to the cultural perspective, yeah, you had some very interesting things to say about our poets and our writers. James Ward wanted to put a question to you. He comments that Northern Ireland contributed to an amazing array of poets, dramatists, and novelists. In your view, was this despite of, or in some way because of, our disastrous political culture?
I think it was both despite and because, in that in most cases, even to this day, the arts are inadequately publicly funded compared with other areas of the UK. It's also, even, well, certainly for the first 50 years, the climate was so repressive that it was very difficult for writers and artists to emerge. But they had to, if they were to be published, they were, the best of them were published in London. Others were published in Dublin. There was nobody going to publish them here. I think the tensions of the place in some ways act as a creative stimulus. People say that you cannot write the great novel about a war while the war is still going on. I think poets have found it easier to, reflect, to encapsulate, the nightmares of the time, sometimes in oblique ways. Our playwrights have certainly addressed virtually every aspect of our conflict, right up until the 80s, 90s. If you produced a particularly controversial play, and especially if you produced it in West Belfast, you were likely to get your funding cut, but nonetheless, it went ahead, and that kind of petty behavior is no longer the case, I think. I've forgotten the exhibition in the Ulster Museum that was taken down because forgotten the name of the artist, because it featured IRA men on the streets of Belfast, and it was the porters who went on strike, the presumably loyalist porters who went on strike or threatened strike action if the exhibition went ahead. That sort of thing was still going on. I think, again, of things like, in my own field, the Lennon Hall Library established the Northern Ireland Political Collection. The very beginning, the police came in and threatened to seize both the collection and the librarian. This is before my time, under the Special Powers Act. But it so happened that one of our governors was friendly with Terence O'Neill's wife and managed to get a direct line to Terence O'Neill. And so the Lennon Hall Library got permission to keep the Northern Ireland Political Collection. But in the 1980s, attempts to, there was a project to have a Northern Ireland bibliography, another current bibliography, a publication that would list all publications in Northern Ireland. And lo and behold, in whatever it was, 1980, whatever, one of the publications was Bobby Sands' poems. And it was included in the bibliography. And then there was a massive protest campaign in the various education and library boards, and that current bibliography ceased publication.
Right. Thank you very much for that, John. I hope you won't mind another couple of minutes just to a few more questions. First of all, lest we forget, Peter is commenting, reminding us all that the Free State was culturally as Philistine and censorious as the North. That's a comment rather than a question. A question here from Anthony Russell. Anthony says, unionism is changing. How different is it now from the 1970s? He cites power sharing, cross-border cooperation and conversations. So is unionism substantively, John?
Well, cross-border bodies. I mean, as of today, our possible new First Minister, Mr. Poots, has refused to attend a cross-border body discussing agriculture. I mean, the difficulty is, unionism has had to change. The difficulty is that it always has to be dragged forward while looking backwards. If only unionism could manage to stop looking backwards and willingly move forward and to reimagine itself in the world that we're actually moving into. It would make things a hell of a sight easier for all of us, including unionists.
Okay. Well, let's wrap up fairly soon. Again, another name from Peter Collins. There was Paul Rose, Labour MP, historically on Northern Ireland. Lots of people thanking you for a very interesting talk and making their comments in the in the chat record here. Perhaps this is an appropriate time just to draw things to a close. Really, thank you everyone so much for tuning into this unique but highly informed perspective from John Gray. Whether you agree with everything John says, or most of what he says, or none of what he says, I'm sure you can only accept that his views and arguments are based on reason and fact and truth. So thank you so much, everyone. Thanks especially to John Gray. Before we end tonight, I just want to tell you a little bit about next week's talk from Padre Gates, which is about labour and partition. That's next Wednesday night at the same time. It's a series of talks from Reclaim the Enlightenment has now begun. John has begun the process, my personal thanks to John and everybody who has participated. Final comments from anyone? Okay. Yeah. Terry is asking me about the Free State Centenary.
Well, we've got Fergus Whelan coming up, who's going to talk about the first
Yes.
10 years of the Cosgrave government. And AKA what I think it was Peter was saying, how dreadfully censorious they were. Well, I don't think Fergus Whelan's going to give the Free State a clean bill of health.
Great. Yes, thanks. Thanks, Terry. Thanks, John. Okay, everyone. All the best to everyone. And see you next time. Thanks a lot. And good night from Reclaim the Enlightenment and Passing in the Tira.
Thanks for coming, everyone.